All right. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today. This is on this dreary day. It's definitely spring in Iowa. This is what we get when we do this together, and we're in a season right now that I'm really excited about. This Phase 3 campaign, and last week we kicked it off with Vision Sunday and cast a vision for Phase 3, and we passed out commitment cards to everybody. And so I want to encourage you, if you have not grabbed a commitment card, they're on a stand right on the other side of the glass garage door there, or you can access an online version of that. But we've been asking you to pray about Phase 3 and what your financial commitment might look like in Phase 3. And so last week we passed out flyers with a brochure, which is also on that stand. And so I would encourage you, over the course of this week, as you have been praying about this, would you make that pledge and that commitment this week so that next week we can announce where we're at in this process? And so, like I said, there's an online one you can do, or you can grab the form there. You can leave it in the offering box, and you can do that anytime this week. We would love to have that before next Sunday, if possible, so that we can announce those commitment goals together. And so really just continue to be praying. How is God prompting me and our family to be part of Phase 3? And last thing before we dive into the message today in this Joy of Generosity series, many years ago, our elders, right at the beginning of our planting as a church, instituted a sabbatical policy for pastors. And my sabbatical, this latest one, has been 6 years in the making. And so our elders have recognized that being on call 24/7 as a pastor takes its toll. And so they have just approved a sabbatical for me. They approved this long ago, and I was actually supposed to take it last summer, but it didn't quite work out that way. And so I have planned to take June and July off. My family will be together for a sabbatical. We'll be traveling and gone this summer, and we are very excited about that. Ministry is exciting, but tiring. And so we are looking forward to just kind of unplugging for a couple of months and coming back in August refreshed and recharged and ready. We have a great slate of guest preachers lined up this summer. And so don't you take the summer off as well, if you would. Continue to be part of the family of Christ this summer. But I want you to be aware of that, and just please pray for my family and I as we have travel plans. We're going to travel quite a bit and be together and refresh. So, all right. We're in our fourth message on the joy of generosity. And this is one of my favorite messages. Like, it's maybe not the best message I've ever preached, okay? So, don't get ready your socks to be blown off. But this topic, I have studied this topic over years, and doing biblical theology all the way through the Bible, I think it answers a lot of questions about the topic of giving. And so I'm really excited to jump in, and we're going to look at the entire Bible today together. And so it'll be awesome, trust me. So I want to start our time together by I want you to think back if you have ever taken a college class. Now, some of you are looking forward to college still, and so you haven't done that, so I'll just have to have you imagine. But if you have ever taken a college class, on day one of class, the professor, he or she hands you a syllabus, this document that lists everything that you are going to have to accomplish over the course of that semester. And if you were taking 5 classes like a normal college load, you got 5 college syllabi together, and many students despise the first week of class because they have something that is known as syllabus shock. Like, how am I going to accomplish all of this? I loved syllabus shock. I liked it. Here's why I liked it. I got to know everything that was expected of me. It was all told to me up front. I could plan in the course of my semester. I could look and say, I don't have to worry about that till later. I need to do this now. I really liked knowing exactly what was expected of me. Now, some of you, as we've been in this series, this is our 4th week on generosity, and I haven't answered a lot of questions like that. We've talked about that God is a joyful owner of everything. Everything is His. We talked about the second week that we're simply managers of what He owns. He's entrusted it to us. But what does that mean? Like, what actually is required of us as followers of Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be generous? How much? I mean, that really, when it comes down to it, how much of the money God has entrusted to you does He require or ask of you? I mean, that's just a simple question. And so today, I mean, is it a tithe? Is it 10%? Is it 23.33% like it was in Moses' day? Or is it whatever you have left over at the end of the day? Or just what you feel like? And what is it? What does God ask? So we're going to look at this whole Bible in context and see what God has asked of His people over the thousands of years in which the Bible was written. And we're going to start with the Old Testament and work through the New. We're going to see 3 kind of concepts from the Old Testament and 4 concepts from the New Testament. And we're going to answer the question, how much does God want me to give? And we'll make stops at the major passages along the way. And so if you're following along in your Bible, you are going to be flipping all over today, and that's great. I'll try to throw a lot of it on the screen for you so you can see, because we're going to make fast movement from this. And this topic it brings me a lot of joy. So these 3 concepts in the Old Testament, let's start there, and let's just start with the first 5 books of the Old Testament called the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These are the 5 books of Moses. And what do we see there? Well, in here we see the principle of tithes and offerings. And this is the first thing we're going to talk about today. Tithes and offerings in the Old Testament. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 14 with the tithe. This is where the tithe is mentioned. Now, if you remember, you'll have to remember back what's happening in Genesis chapter 14. But God picked out a guy named Abraham. He said, go to the land I will show you. So Abram left his land and he landed in the land of Canaan. And God made a covenant and a promise with Abram. Now Abram's hanging out in the land with his nephew Lot. And they split up a little bit, and Lot goes one way, Abraham goes the other, and Lot gets taken captive by a bunch of hooligans. And they just take him, and they've got him, and Abraham hears this. And so Abraham grabs 318 men from his household. So a household isn't a nuclear family like we think about it. A household is all your children, all your grandchildren, all your servants that were in the house, workers, hired people, everyone together. Abraham had a lot. He had a lot of hired men. He grabs 318 of them. They go out, they attack the hooligans, and they grab Lot, and they take him away. And because they defeated the enemy, as a tradition at the time, they take the spoils of war with them. Abraham's got all the spoils of this victory, and he's heading back home with Lot. He comes across a guy named Melchizedek, who is a priest of God, it says. And the text in Genesis chapter 14 explains this, what happens. It simply says this, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was priest of God Most High. We're getting given little other explanation than that. And he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. The concept of a tenth or a tithe was a concept well known in the period of Abraham and in the early culture of the world. And Abraham seems to think that it was his responsibility to give 10% of what he took in battle to this priest of God, Melchizedek. And this pattern, this tithe, starts here. The word tithe is mentioned 32 times in the Old Testament. The pattern continues with Abraham's grandson Jacob. He also promised to give 10% to God, although I think Jacob was just trying to manipulate God with that. But we see this pattern. The pattern continues through the era of the patriarchs. Tithe. This is where you get this idea of tithe. We see 10% tithe discussed as early as Abraham, and it's this pattern. But everything changes when we get to Moses. 600 years after Abraham, we get to Moses, and Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and God gives him the law of Moses. A new period is instituted, and all of a sudden, now we don't just have a tithe, we have tithes, multiple tithes going on in the Old Testament. And these are the things that when people talk about tithing, they forget to tell you. Because now we're not just talking about 10%, we're talking about 23 and a third percent. Here's how you get there. They were required in the Old Testament to give 10% to the Levites. Numbers chapter 18. The Levites were essentially assistants to the priests, and they had no inheritance in the land. And so they were, once a year, 10% go to support the Levites. And then another tithe to the festival. In Deuteronomy 14, God says, take 10% of everything, bring it in, and we are going to have a massive party, a festival celebrating God and His goodness. So you got 10% to the Levites, 10% to the festival. And then he says in Deuteronomy chapter 14, later on, he says, and every 3 years, another tithe for the poor, to care for the poor. So if you break that down, every year, 23 and a third percent. That's the tithe expectation. And so all of a sudden, we see, and by Jesus' day, this concept of the triple tithe, as it's called, was well enshrined in Jewish law. Like they got this, that they were supposed to do this. It's a lot, 23 and a third percent. Now, as we continue through these first 5 books, we also see tithes, triple tithes. We also see offerings. And we're going to have an offering called a free will offering. And this is another kind of gift. This one is not under compulsion and obligation like the triple tithe was. This is a free will. You do it if you want to. And so in this passage in Exodus, we're going to see that Moses sets out to build a tabernacle, a mobile temple to God, a tent that is extravagant and glorious that will serve as this mobile temple to the living God. And he says, we need to accumulate the resources to build this. And so in Exodus 35, he says, everyone who was willing and whose heart moved him came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work. Willing and heart. This was not any sense of obligation. A free will offering was just, I'm excited. I'm moved. I want to give. And oh my goodness, when you read this passage in Exodus 35, listen to the things they gave. I'm just going to read a few verses here. All who were willing, men and women alike, came and brought gold and jewelry of all kinds. And then there's a long list of all the kinds of things they brought. Every skilled woman spun with her hands and brought what she had spun, blue, purple, scarlet, yarn, a fine linen. The list just goes on. The leaders brought onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and the breastplate. Those are the things that the priest wore. On and on, the leaders are contributing to this. And then in 29, all the Israelites, men and women who were willing, brought to the Lord free will offerings for all the work the Lord through Moses had commanded them to do. So we have a triple tithe, and then on top of that, there are free will offerings, things that you want to do, excitement. And notice the excitement in the text. These people are just thrilled to be contributing to this. It's all about joy. Why didn't God mandate this one? I mean, He mandated a triple tithe. Why didn't He mandate the offering for the tabernacle? He goes, now I'm going to take another tithe. I got this in place. Why didn't He do that? Well, I think it's because it's His house. He wants it to be built with joy. Have you ever gone to a restaurant with a big party of people, and when you get your bill, you see the mandatory gratuity for parties of 7 or more? Have you ever had that? You know, you're like, I don't know how you feel about that. Why do they do that? Well, because people are cheap, and in splitting the bill, the server gets left out, right? They get it, right? Okay. But I don't know. When I have a really good server, I'm joyful to tip that server well. But when I have to, there's no joy in that at all. And I think the same principle applies to the temple, like to this tabernacle. God wants the joy, free will, and the people are excited to do that. So we've got 2 tithes and then one last 2 offerings, one last one here. And the principle here in tithes and offering is first fruits. And we're sticking with the Pentateuch here. And Leviticus chapter 23, we're reminded that the Lord said to Moses, bring to the priest, he's going to describe what their offering looks like. A sheaf of the first grain of your harvest. He's to wave the sheaf before the Lord, and on the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice a burnt offering to the Lord, a lamb a year old without defect. I put the 2 key phrases on the screen for you so you can see them. God wants them to bring the first of the harvest. He says, don't go around and after you get the harvest done, don't go around the edge of the field and pick, the little ones that barely made it at the edge, or the ones that aren't really worth it. That's not the one you should bring to me, God says. You go into the best of the crop. Take the first of it, and you give that to me. I want the first of the resources I have provided for you. The best. The same is about a lamb a year old without defect. I mean, if you had a herd. A herd of sheep or animals, and you can tell I'm not a farmer. Dave over here, suburbanite kid, right? Anyway, if you had this herd of animals, you go, oh man, like I could get some good money for these. But this one over here that, is scrawny, and I'm going to give that one to God. God can have that one since it's just going to be slaughtered anyway. Like, what's the big deal? God says, no, take the first and the best. The best. You give that. And so we get this concept of the Old Testament in tithes and offerings. This is kind of the first picture we get of God wants our first, not our last. Why does God do that? Because he knows our heart. We'll just leave God till last. And God wants to be first in our lives. We have something in the Brooks household called leftover night. I know that this is good stewardship as a family, to eat up the leftovers in the fridge and not just throw them away. I hate leftover night. I mean, I'm the one that brings the food home from the restaurant, the leftovers, sticks it in the fridge, forgets about it for 2.5 weeks, and then we throw it away later. Or if I don't actually forget it on the table in the container, I've known to do that too. But I just don't like leftover night. I get it why we have to do it. The only good leftover night is Giordano's pizza. That is good. That is some good leftovers right there. But that's it. That's it. The rest of it, it's like, leftover night. I like a meal prepared especially for me. I don't like leftovers. God doesn't want to be leftover in our life. And yet, truthfully, most people, when they consider what to give back to God, consider him last. We think, how big of a house can we afford? What kind of food can we put on the table? What restaurants are we going to? Have we paid our utilities? Is the Netflix subscription and the Cubs marquee sports package, is that in there? All my kids, everything they need and want. How much are my debts? Where do I want to go on vacation? What's Uncle Sam going to take? Or what do I need to put in savings for retirement? And whatever is left, that I'll give to God. And it's usually not much. God doesn't want to be leftover. He wants the first. One of the first fruits principles here is decide what you're going to give to God first. I mean, he gave everything you have to you. So he should get it back first. So before your taxes, before your mortgage, before your loan company, before you go to Fairway and buy groceries, before insurance, before Waukee Community Schools, before all of this, decide, what does God get? I don't know if you have budget time in your family where you sit down and you go, what's the budget look like? The first line item should be what goes back to God, because everything is his, and he gets first fruits of it. And so, all of this to say, God first. We're the managers of his money. And I think in the Old Testament, first 5 books, we see the principle of the tithe, the triple tithe, and then we see this free will offering and this first fruits offering. Let's continue our survey with the second principle, and this one will be very quickly. We're going to see in the poetry, so this is right in the middle of your Bible, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, the wisdom or poetic literature. And then we continue in through the prophets. All the end of your Old Testament is all the prophets put together. And I think there's one overarching principle we would take from here, and that is the idea of justice. The prophets and the poets call God's people to use his resource to mitigate against injustice in the world. And in light of the Old Testament, that's particularly the widows, the orphans, those who are impoverished, aliens it talks about a lot, not outer space aliens, but local alien types. And we're supposed to take care of those needs. So this idea of justice, Proverbs chapter 21 says, whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. God cares. He wants us to use our resources to help and care for others. And so just as we saw about the law and a tithe, this is not rote obedience, because if we do rote obedience, we risk neglecting the heart of God. God cares about this and wants us to manage his resources by thinking about this. The last thing in the Old Testament then is the idea of trust and obedience. So we've looked at tithes and offerings, the idea of justice, and now we come to trust and obedience. And we get to the book of Malachi, the last prophet. I named my last son after this prophet, and so because he's the last son. And so, trust me, he's it. Okay, in Malachi, we see this in chapter 3. You have to put this in context. So, do you remember we've been talking through Jeremiah a lot, and at the end of Jeremiah, Jerusalem is destroyed and the people are taken to exile back into Babylon, which turns into Persia. And then the Persian king says, okay, 70 years are up, it's time to go home. And he sends a few, whatever's left, a few of them back to Jerusalem, and they begin to rebuild the city, and they're trying to figure all this out. And you can imagine they're trying to obey the triple tithe, plus the taxes that the king of Persia put on them, which was not a small amount. And so, and they don't even hardly have a roof over their heads, and they're just struggling to get everything done. A temple built, a city rebuilt, and it's hard. And by the time we get to Malachi, we can see they are giving their time to rebuilding the city. And they're saying probably, isn't my time enough? Like, this is too burdensome for me. Look at Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you'll ask, wait, what? How do we rob you, God? In tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. God says to them, listen, you are neglecting everything that we have talked about. You're actually robbing me because I gave it to you to manage, and you're hoarding it for yourself. This is hard language. But look what God says here. It continues. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have enough room for it. Now, this is a really important passage because God says, listen, I know it's burdensome. I know you don't think you can do it, but if you trust me in this, I will take care of you. Now, I will just stop for a second and pause because we have to answer was this abomination that started in America and has spread throughout the world, known as the health and wealth gospel. It says that God exists solely for your wealth and your health, and that should be your goal. If you do all the things that they say right, then you too will be rich beyond your wildest dreams. You'll have all your health problems answered, and everything will be great. All relationships will be harmonious. You just give to me so I can get my gold toilet and do it. I talk about this a lot, and because this is such an abomination to the Scripture. God is not saying, if you do this, I will make you rich beyond your wildest dream. God's saying, I know how hard it is. You trust me. If you trust me in this, I will take care of you. I'll take care of you. Trust and obedience. So this is how we wrap up our Old Testament survey of the idea of giving. We see tithes and offerings, we see the idea of justice, and then we see this idea of just trusting and being obedient to God. Now, we flip the page and we turn to the New Testament. Hundreds of years after the close of the Old Testament, Jesus is born. He lives, he dies, he rises from the dead and ascended into heaven, and his church is assembled. And this thing that we are part of here 2,000 years later that is still moving and going. And the New Testament scriptures are important in what it says. So I want to look quickly at 4 things that the New Testament says about giving. In the Gospels. So the first text we have is the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All 4 are accounts from different perspectives of the life of Jesus. And here's one of the things that Jesus does. Jesus only mentions the tithe 3 times. And not necessarily 3 times in support of it. He just talks about it 3 times. The rest of the time, he does talk about a percentage. It's just not 10%. Jesus has a percentage in mind of what giving looks like. I want you to think through 2 stories in the Gospels. Jesus is talking to a rich man who wants to know, okay, what's required of me? What's required of me? I'd like to get into heaven someday. What's required? I've obeyed the whole law. I've done everything. I've done it all. Am I going to get in? And Jesus says, you lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor. I mean, that's a percentage. It's 100%. Think of the woman. They're sitting there outside the temple, and there's an offering box, and people are coming in, and they're like, I contribute $4 billion. I don't know. They didn't have dollars, but a lot of money, and they're boasting, and they're telling everyone. And this woman publicly comes up and puts in a couple pennies into the box, and people are kind of mocking her and making fun of her. And Jesus says, oh, don't do that. He says, this woman should be honored. 2 pennies. Like, sweet. I only have to give 2 pennies. That's great. Well, except Jesus says, because those are the last 2 pennies she had. Oh, there's a percentage. It's 100%. So what is the principle Jesus is getting at here? The principle is generosity. Jesus is not saying 10% is the mandate. He's not saying 23 and a third percent. He's saying you recognizing that everything you have belongs to God and being generous with that because He's generous. That's the idea here. Now we have to put in principle here an important interpretive framework for understanding the significance of the Old Testament and the significance of the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said this phrase which is really, really important to grasp. He says, I did not come to abolish the law. He's talking about the law of Moses. I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. And Jesus did. He lived a perfect life. He did what you and I cannot. And so when He spread out His arms on the cross and He died for our sins in our place, He said, I know that you can't ever be good enough or do enough. You can't. So I'm going to do it for you. I fulfilled the law on your behalf. This is so beautiful. The law is fulfilled. It is brought to completion. So now we live as those who have perfectly fulfilled the law, even though we can't. I mean, it's this beautiful principle. And this is why the language about giving changes in the New Testament from a mandated tithe and an offering. It changes to the focus now is on the free will part. The free will offering. Moving as God moves in you. The tithe is a good principle to follow. I mean, before the law ever exists, Abraham's showing us this 10%, and we're getting this principle. It's a good principle to follow. If you come up with a better one that helps you be generous, then go for it. It's a good measuring stick, but it's not a law any longer because Jesus fulfilled it. It's not a law. How am I supposed to figure this out, Dave? Well, there's some other New Testament words about giving that help us kind of figure it out. So we have generous giving, and then in the book of Acts we see sacrificial giving. This is the giving that hurts. In Acts chapter 4, the early church gave to each other when there was some person in need. One person had a need, another person sold their property and gave it to them. They gave them the money. They just did this willingly. No one told them, you have to do this. Their hearts were moved, and they did things that hurt. It was sacrificial. And there's this joy. In 2 Corinthians 8, we find out the Macedonians gave out of their extreme poverty. I mean, this principle, the early church in the book of Acts, we see them sacrificially giving to others. And there is a joy in meeting the needs in the body of Christ. The early church took it serious. And like I mentioned last week, this is awesome when it works. It usually means sacrifice, and generosity usually hurts. There is something to give up. I will never forget when I was a kid. My parents got this cool thing called cable TV. Now, some of you are going to remember this, but on top of our tube TV sat a little box, and it had all these punch buttons on this box, and a very long cable that went to the back of the TV. I discovered if you threw this at your brother's head, you could hurt him. But anyway, that's another thing. I have a temper. But this cable TV box was amazing because we had a button on there that was for WGN. And you know what was on WGN when I was a kid? Yeah, the Cubs. I could watch every afternoon game at Wrigley Field in the summer. I mean, this was great stuff. Ryan Sandberg and the whole deal. I got to watch it all like I was in heaven. And you know what my parents did? One time, there was this need that was brought up at church, and they just really felt convicted about how they were going to meet this need. And so they prayed about it, and they said, I think we can give up cable TV so that we can use that money to support this need. They did not consult me. I lost the Cubs. Are you serious? This sacrifice hurt. It was painful for me. But you know what? It was good. It was good for me to go without something for the benefit of somebody else. This was good. It was sacrificial in a small, teeny, tiny way. It's good. This is a principle. Not only generous giving, sacrificial giving. And then we come to the third thing in the New Testament, regular giving. 1 Corinthians 16:2, on the first day of the week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money. On the first day, make it a pattern. Give regularly, consistently, not sporadically, because rhythms and patterns are important. So there is still a place for the weekly offering. Our financial team tells me that some of you write there's these things called checks. I know they're really old school, but there's these things. You write one every single week and put it, that's awesome. There's a beauty in that. But let's be honest, our world has changed and things are different now. And sometimes that's really hard, especially if you don't even have a checkbook. And most of us don't get paid weekly. It doesn't work like that. So the principle here is regularly. Figure that out. If you get paid once a month, contribute once a month. That's regular. You get paid every 2 weeks, figure it out that way. Figure out a way to be regularly contributing in that. There's this thing that many of your banks have called online bill pay. You can set it up regularly, mail a check to 215 North Warrior Lane, and you can send it there. That happens. We have people do that. I know so many of you have taken advantage of our online giving platform. It makes it really easy to put a regular process in your life to give regularly. And I don't know. I mean, some of you are like, hey, I own my own business and I get paid 3 times a year. Okay, then 3 times a year is regular. That's what I'm talking about. It's not a law, it's a principle. And the principle is be regularly involved in giving. And then the fourth thing for the New Testament is proportional. And this is why the tithe is not a law for Christians. Proportional giving is. The second half of this verse, 1 Corinthians 16, you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. The beauty of the New Testament is the law of God is written on our hearts. So 10% could be overly burdensome for some, and 10% could be not enough for many. You have to figure this out. You figure out a proportion. I would encourage you to think of it as a percentage. Just pick a percentage and do it and feel joyful in this. That's part of it. So many years ago when I was in seminary, already I'm shelling out money for school and I'm moonlighting on the side working, and Clarissa was working full-time as a nanny at that point, and I think she was making $5 an hour probably. It's a long time ago. And she got pregnant with Nicholas, and Nicholas was going to be born, and I was only halfway through my 3-year Master of Divinity program. And I just remember thinking, how are we going to do this? And God took care of us in some really cool ways for another time. But at the same time, we were really involved in our local church. And I just really sensed the call to be faithful. And I sort of had this 10% thing in mind. And I just we were making nothing. And so I just remember that we set out a regular gift. And it wasn't much. It was pretty small. And I said, God, I just sensed God would be pleased with this. It was sacrificial. It was proportional. It was a small proportion, but it's what we had. And, at the end of the day, in that church budget, it made no difference whatsoever, right? But it wasn't about that. It was about me wanting to be joyfully obedient. Clarissa wanting to be joyfully obedient. And so here's what we did. I finally got a new job, a full-time job, my first ministry position, and moved in, and not making much more than I was in seminary, but we committed, and we couldn't get to 10%, but I committed. Every time I got a raise, we were going to give more than 10% to the church, so we could try to get to where we thought God wanted us to be. And here's the deal: I never missed a mortgage payment. We never went without food. I mean, sometimes it was mac and cheese, but we never went hungry. We never stressed. I didn't have mountains of debt. God took care of us. He said, test me in this. And God was faithful to us. So I think this is my challenge to you. I'm just working under the assumption that what's driving you should say, I want to be obedient and joyful to the call that God has given me. And so I would say to you, just pick a percentage. Find one. I don't know what it is. No one is going to track it and call you or text you. That's not going to happen, because it's just about you being joyfully obedient. And I mean, it was just tax time. You know what you gave last year. All your charitable giving comes in and you get receipts for all of it. Put a percentage to it. And say, God, is this what you want? So how much should you give? You need to have this serious conversation with God. If you're married, make time with your spouse. Write a budget. Most people don't have a budget. You should do a budget. You should put God at the top, giving at the top. So let's put it all together. So Old Testament, New Testament, 5 things that I want you to take from this. I'm going to wrap it all up in this quick summary. First fruits, generous, sacrificial, regular, and proportional. Those are the 5 words that describe giving. God gets the first. Pick an amount that is generous, that brings you joy. Be sacrificial. It should hurt a little. Be regular. Make a regular habit of it. And turn that tithe into percentage, whatever that is. If you aren't giving to a regular ministry of your local church, I just would encourage you, just rethink that. Now, the second thing is, what does this have to do with phase 3? Well, I want you to think of the idea here of this free will offering. Because in above and beyond what God calls you to give back to your local church and ministry, each of you should give what you've decided in your hearts. 2 Corinthians 9. Not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. In your heart. Listen, that's just what it's about. And secondly, joyful. God loves a cheerful giver. Be joyful. Soon after Olivia was born, back when we only had 5 kids, I remember I just wanted to do something. We were on vacation somewhere, and I just wanted to take them to a restaurant. And you have to understand, we never took our kids to restaurants when they were little. They didn't know how to eat at a restaurant. They didn't even know how to order off a menu, And I've got these 5 kids. Olivia was probably in a little, high chair seat thing, and we're sitting around this table, and the kids look at the menu, and they're looking down, and they're like, "Dad, what can I order?" And I had saved up money for this occasion, and I said, "You can order whatever you want." Now, none of them liked steak, so I knew that wasn't going to happen, all right? So, they're like, "Oh, I want chicken tenders with extra fries." Okay. And their eyes were this big. I had to teach them how to sit at a table and eat at a restaurant and how to talk to a waiter, a server. Had to teach them all this. But the joy in their little hearts that they could order whatever they want made that, it's just solidified in my brain. It brought me so much joy. Giving away the resources that God has entrusted you to manage should bring you great joy. It should fill up your heart. It should make you say, "I want God to have back what is rightfully His," because that brings me joy. Next Sunday is Commitment Sunday for phase 3. And I have no idea, you guys have no idea how we're going to do this. I don't know. But here's what I've learned. God moves in the hearts of His people to do extraordinary things. Things that not one of us could do on our own. There's not a person in this room, I think, that could meet, maybe there is, but that could meet that whole goal. I don't know, probably not. But together, God moves in His people to joyfully participate. And that's all I'm asking. That's all I'm asking, is that you would be filled with joy. Because God is the fount of every blessing. That is what we're going to sing as a closer. I'm going to pray, and our worship team is going to sneak up behind me while I'm praying, and then we are going to close in song. Heavenly Father, we bow our heads and pause, and we thank You. Whether You've entrusted us with a little to manage or a lot, we acknowledge that it is all Yours. And out of joy, we ask that You would just lead us with a spirit inside of us to participate in whatever way You deem. Oh, God, that's up to You. We ask that joy would fill this place as together we respond to Your goodness to us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand as we close this?